The people meant to save him couldn't. The one who shouldn't have, did. At Mead Plantation, smoke began curling through the wooden beams before anyone smelled fire. Lewis Herring was standing near the front steps when someone shouted his name. "Sir, there's a problem inside." London Herring turned just as the smoke alarm screamed. Her face drained of color. "Frankie," she said. Then louder, panicked. "Frankie's upstairs." For a moment, Lewis didn't move. His mind stalled on the word upstairs. Firefighters rushed past them, boots pounding against old wood. One of them stopped suddenly, looking up at the second-floor window where smoke pushed outward. "That room's compromised," the fire captain said, already calculating. "We're not clear to go in yet." London grabbed Lewis's arm. "He's right there," she cried. "He's right there." Near the side of the house, Miriam Morrison stood frozen beside an unsecured ladder, her eyes locked on the window above. From inside, the baby began to cry. Not loud, not frantic, just enough to let them know he was still alive. Miriam swallowed. "If we wait," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, "he won't be." No one answered her. The fire crackled. The ladder stood untouched. And in that silence, Miriam made a choice no one had given her permission to make. Stories like this don't survive on algorithms, they survive on people who care. If this story means something to you, subscribe so stories like this don't disappear. And if you'd like to, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We will love to know. The morning had started with noise. Thomas Keene, the estate manager and contractor, arrived at the Herring Mansion on 110 Leek Ave before sunrise with his crew, their boots echoing across the aged wooden floors of Mead Plantation. The electrical upgrades were overdue, everyone knew that. But historic homes like this one, with their century-old beams, didn't bend easily to modern safety codes. Miriam Morrison, the poor maid and caregiver to the Herring family, stood in the corner of the kitchen, folding little Frankie's laundry while the workers drilled into the plaster walls. She watched them thread new wires behind panels that hadn't been opened in decades. The wooden structure groaned under their tools, dust falling like ash from the ceiling. "Did you hear that crackling earlier?" London Herring, the mother and wife of billionaire Lewis Herring, asked, pausing at the doorway. Her voice carried that hesitant tone Miriam had come to recognize the sound of a mother's instinct fighting against inconvenience. Thomas Keene barely looked up from his clipboard. "These houses are old. It's been checked." Miriam said nothing aloud, but her fingers tightened around the tiny shirt in her hands. "Old doesn't mean safe," she whispered to herself. By noon, the crew had packed up and left. The walls were sealed again, pristine and white, hiding whatever they'd done behind aged beams and narrow cavities where air moved in ways no architect had planned. Frankie Herring, the toddler son, was fussy, rubbing his eyes, and London handed him off to Miriam with an exhausted smile. "Nap time," London said. "Upstairs, please." Miriam carried Frankie up the narrow staircase, his small body warm against her chest. She settled him into his crib near the outward opening window, pulling the curtains just enough to dim the afternoon light. He was asleep within minutes. As she descended the stairs, something stopped her. A smell, faint, acrid, wrong. Not smoke. Not yet. Something electrical, like copper heated too fast. Warnings don't shout, they whisper. And Miriam had learned long ago to listen to whispers. She stood in the hallway, hand pressed against the plaster wall. It was warm. Not hot, but warmer than it should be. "Mrs. Herring?" she called softly. No answer. London had retreated to her study. Lewis Herring, the billionaire father, was at his office downtown. Eleanor Herring, the grandmother, wouldn't arrive until evening. Miriam looked back up the stairs toward Frankie's room. Her pulse quickened. Most disasters don't begin loudly. They begin when someone decides not to look twice. She pressed her palm harder against the wall. Inside the wooden structure at 110 Leek Ave, behind plaster and insulation, a wire touched something it shouldn't. A spark flared. then another. The danger has already entered the house. The smoke alarm shattered the afternoon silence like a scream ripping through glass. Miriam Morrison was folding linens in the laundry room when the piercing wail erupted. Her hands froze mid-fold, every nerve in her body suddenly alert. Within seconds, she smelled it thick, chemical smoke pouring through the ventilation. "Fire!" Thomas Keene's voice boomed from somewhere near the front entrance. "Everyone out! Now!" The historic wooden structure of Mead Plantation became chaos in an instant. Staff members rushed from every corner: the cook, the gardener, 2 housekeepers Miriam barely knew by name. They stampeded toward the exits as smoke began seeping through cracks in the plaster walls, dark tendrils curling along the ceiling. London Herring stumbled out of her study, coughing, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening? Where's—" Then her face went white. "Frankie's still inside." London's scream cut through everything. She lunged toward the narrow staircase, but Thomas Keene grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Herring, you can't." Lewis Herring burst through the front door, having raced back from a meeting downtown. His billionaire composure shattered the moment he saw his wife's face. "No, he was just asleep." His voice cracked, his hands shaking as he stared up at the second floor where smoke was now billowing from beneath the door frames. The fire wasn't spreading across the open halls like a normal blaze. It was racing upward inside the walls, through the ancient wooden beams and cavities, feeding on decades of dry timber and faulty wiring. The aged structure was burning from within, invisible and unstoppable. Miriam was already moving. Emergency doesn't wait for certainty. She pushed past frozen guests and panicking staff, her worn shoes pounding against the floorboards. "Which room?" she demanded, grabbing London's shoulders. "The nursery, second door on the right." London's words dissolved into sobs. "The window, it opens outward." Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called 911. But everyone standing in that driveway knew the same terrible truth. Help was coming, but it wouldn't arrive in time. Smoke poured from the upstairs windows now, thick and black against the afternoon sky. The outward opening windows that made the historic mansion so charming now trapped the heat and smoke inside, turning the second floor into an oven. Lewis tried to rush the stairs. 2 men held him back as he fought and screamed his son's name. Eleanor Herring, the grandmother, had just arrived, her car screeching into the driveway. She collapsed against the hood, her hands pressed to her mouth. Miriam stood at the base of the staircase, staring up into the smoke. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear Frankie crying now, a thin, terrified wail cutting through the roar of flames hidden behind the walls. Everyone knows where the baby is, and no one can reach him. The fire trucks arrived in under 4 minutes, red and chrome flashing against the smoke-darkened sky. Firefighters poured out in coordinated chaos, their boots hitting the gravel driveway with military precision. Caleb Rowe, the fire captain, was the first to assess the mansion. His eyes swept the historic wooden structure with the sharp calculation of a man who'd seen too many old buildings burn. He moved quickly along the perimeter, studying the plaster walls, the way smoke billowed from beneath window frames, the ominous glow flickering behind second-floor glass. "Captain," one of his men called. "Structural integrity?" Caleb pressed his gloved hand against the exterior wall near the foundation. It vibrated with heat. He looked up at the narrow staircase visible through the open front door, then at the aged beams supporting the upper floor. His jaw tightened. Lewis Herring rushed toward him, his expensive suit rumpled, his face streaked with ash. "My son is up there. Second door on the right. You have to." "I know." Caleb cut him off, his voice steady but firm. "We're setting up now." "Now?" Lewis's voice cracked. "He's been in there for—" "Mr. Herring." Caleb turned to face the billionaire father directly. "That upper floor is compromised. The fire's been burning inside the walls for at least 20 minutes. The load-bearing beams." "I don't care about beams." Lewis lunged forward, but 2 firefighters intercepted him. "That's my son." Caleb's team was already positioning the ladder truck, angling it toward Frankie's window. But Caleb raised his fist, halting the operation. His second-in-command shot him a questioning look. Sir, we have the angle. And the floor? Caleb pointed up. You see how that smoke's moving? The structure's cooking from the inside. If that floor drops while we're on it, I lose my men. Lewis grabbed Caleb's coat. So, you're telling me to wait? Caleb met his eyes not with coldness, but with the weight of impossible choices. I'm telling you I can't lose 2 lives. The words hit like a physical blow. Lewis staggered backward, caught by Thomas Keene. London collapsed to her knees in the grass, her hands covering her face. Eleanor Herring stood frozen, her lips moving in silent prayer. Miriam Morrison watched from the edge of the driveway, her fingers digging into her palms. She could still hear Frankie's cries, fainter now, weaker. The smoke was thicker. Time was a knife cutting away hope with every second. Caleb barked orders to his crew. Get thermal imaging. I need to know where the fire's traveling. Prep the ladder, but nobody goes up until I clear it. His men moved with disciplined speed, but everyone could see what they were really doing, buying time they didn't have, waiting for a miracle that might not come. Wisdom protects many, but it breaks the heart of the one. Lewis sank to the ground, his hands in his hair. Please, he whispered to no one and everyone. Please. The mansion groaned, a deep, wooden sound that made every firefighter tense. Help is present, and still powerless. The sound that broke London Herring wasn't the roar of flames or the crack of burning timber. It was the cry of her son. Frankie's small face appeared at the nursery window, pressed against the glass. His mouth was open in a wail that barely carried over the chaos below, his tiny hands slapping the pane. Behind him, orange light flickered flames crawling up the interior walls, devouring curtains, reaching for the crib. Please, he's right there. London's voice shattered into something raw and animal. She fought against the firefighters holding her back, clawing at their arms. He's right there. The ladder truck stood positioned but motionless, its metal rungs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Unsecured, waiting for clearance that wouldn't come. Caleb Rowe stood beside it, radio pressed to his ear, his face carved from stone as he listened to the thermal imaging report. Negative, Captain. Floor joists are failing. Estimated collapse in 3 to 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes. Frankie's cries grew weaker. The smoke inside the nursery was visible now, thick gray clouds pressing against the window glass. Lewis Herring had gone silent, his body rigid with a kind of shock that transcends screaming. Eleanor clutched her chest, gasping. Thomas Keene stood with his clipboard hanging useless at his side, his contractor's mind calculating what everyone already knew. The math didn't work. There wasn't enough time. Miriam Morrison stood 15 feet from the ladder, her heart a war drum in her chest. She watched Frankie's small silhouette fade and reappear through the smoke. She looked at the outward opening window frame, the kind that swung toward the outside, away from the building, not bolted shut, just latched from within. If someone could reach it. If someone was already there when it opened. Ma'am, step back. A firefighter moved to escort her further from the scene. Miriam didn't step back. This is usually where people stop watching because staying means responsibility. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. 1 step. 2. Her worn shoes scuffing against gravel. Faith sometimes moves before permission, her grandmother used to say. The old woman who raised her on nothing but prayer and conviction. The voice that taught her to see what needed doing and not wait for the world's approval. Miriam's hand touched the cold metal of the unsecured ladder. Hey, Caleb's voice cut through the noise. Get away from that equipment. But Miriam wasn't listening anymore. She thought of Frankie's weight in her arms that morning, the way he'd curled into her shoulder, trusting, the warmth of his small body. She thought of London's face, breaking apart with helplessness. She thought of every moment in her life when someone had told her to wait, to step back, to let someone more qualified handle it, and how that waiting had cost everything. If I don't go, no one will. The words left her lips as a whisper, a prayer, a declaration. Miriam grabbed the ladder with both hands and started climbing. Shouts erupted behind her. Footsteps pounded, but she was already 3 rungs up, then 6, then 10, her body moving with a speed born of pure, desperate purpose. Miriam grabs the ladder. The ladder shook with every step Miriam Morrison climbed. Daylight streamed across Mead plantation in cruel contrast to the nightmare unfolding. Flames consumed the upper nursery, their orange tongues licking out through broken window glass, devouring the historic mansion from within. The ladder stood angled sharply toward Frankie's window, unsecured and trembling. Miriam had no gear. No helmet, no gloves, no oxygen mask. Just her worn uniform and a poor maid's determination that outweighed every protocol Caleb Rowe had ever written. "Get her down," Caleb shouted, but his men hesitated. Moving now might shake the ladder worse, might send her tumbling 30 feet to the ground. Below, London and Lewis Herring stood frozen in horror and hope, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Eleanor Herring prayed aloud, her voice carrying across the lawn. Thomas Keene held his breath. Miriam reached the window. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, she could see Frankie pressed against the glass, his face streaked with tears and soot. His small hands slapped weakly at the pane. "Look at me, baby," Miriam called through the smoke. "I've got you." She braced herself against the ladder with one arm and reached for the window latch. The outward opening frame was hot to the touch, the metal already warping from the heat inside. She twisted the latch. It gave. The window swung open violently, releasing a blast of superheated air and smoke that nearly knocked Miriam off the ladder. She grabbed the frame with both hands, holding on as the ladder shifted beneath her weight, a sickening sideways lurch that sent gasps rippling through the crowd below. "Careful," Caleb's voice cracked with urgency. Miriam pulled herself level with the window. Inside, the nursery was hell itself. Flames crawled up the walls, the ceiling sagging and blackened. The crib was already burning. Frankie stood near the window, coughing, his small body swaying. She reached through the opening. "Come here, sweetheart. Come to Miriam." Frankie lurched forward, and Miriam caught him under the arms. His weight nearly pulled her through the window, but she locked her leg around the ladder rung and held. The window frame splintered beside her head, wood cracking from the heat, screws popping loose. She pulled Frankie out through the opening and pressed him against her chest, shielding his small body with hers as embers rained down around them. His coughs were desperate, painful, but he was breathing. Love does what rules cannot. "I'm coming down," Miriam shouted. The descent was slower, more deliberate. Every rung a negotiation with gravity and terror. Frankie clung to her neck, his face buried in her shoulder. Halfway down, the ladder jerked again, the mansion's wall shifting as the structure continued to fail. At the bottom, Elena Brooks, the paramedic, was already waiting with a gurney and oxygen. Miriam stepped off the final rung and immediately thrust Frankie toward her. "Is he breathing?" Miriam gasped. Elena took the toddler, her trained hands moving quickly. "He's breathing. Pulse is strong. Frankie, can you hear me?" The small boy coughed and nodded weakly. London collapsed with relief, her scream of joy mixing with sobs. Lewis ran to the gurney, his hands hovering over his son, afraid to touch him, afraid he might disappear. "The baby is saved." Miriam stood swaying in the grass, smoke rising from her singed uniform. Her hands were raw and blistered, her lungs burned. The adrenaline that had carried her up that ladder was draining away like water through cupped fingers. "Ma'am." A firefighter approached. "Ma'am, you need to." Miriam's legs buckled. Miriam collapses. Miriam Morrison didn't feel the pain until she hit the ground. Elena Brooks was beside her in seconds, professional hands assessing damage with swift efficiency. Possible smoke inhalation, burns on both hands. And she palpated Miriam's left arm carefully, feeling the unnatural angle. Fractured radius. "We need transport now." A second ambulance pulled up behind the first. The paramedics moved Miriam onto a stretcher, strapping oxygen over her face. Her vision swam, the world tilting sideways. Through the haze, she could see the Herring family, clustered around Frankie's gurney 20 feet away. London was crying and laughing simultaneously, her hands stroking her son's hair. Lewis held Frankie's small hand, his shoulders shaking with relief. Eleanor Herring stood over them both, her lips still moving in grateful prayer. Even Thomas Keene had moved closer, his face slack with the kind of awe reserved for miracles. No one looked toward the second ambulance. "You should have waited," Elena said quietly, as she secured the IV line in Miriam's good arm. There was no judgment in her voice, only the tired honesty of someone who'd seen too many heroes pay the bill. Miriam's throat was raw, her voice barely a whisper. There wasn't time. Elena nodded slowly, checking the oxygen flow. No, there wasn't. Across the lawn, Frankie coughed and reached for his mother. London gathered him close, burying her face in his soot-stained hair. "Thank God, thank God," Lewis repeated, his voice breaking. He kissed his son's forehead, his hands trembling. The family formed a tight circle around the boy: grandmother, father, mother, estate manager, a universe of relief that had no room for anything else. Some sacrifices disappear the moment they're made. The first ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, carrying Frankie and London toward the hospital. Lewis climbed into his car to follow, Eleanor beside him. Thomas Keene stayed behind to speak with the fire marshal about the mansion's structural damage. Caleb Rowe approached Miriam's ambulance just as the doors were closing. He met her eyes through the oxygen mask, a look of respect mixed with something heavier. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. "You did good," he said simply. Then the doors shut, and Miriam was alone with Elena and the paramedic driver. The ambulance rolled forward. No sirens. No urgency. The emergency had already been resolved. The miracle had already happened. It's easier to celebrate the miracle than to ask who paid for it. At the hospital, Miriam was treated for second-degree burns on both palms, severe smoke inhalation, and a fractured left radius that required a cast. The doctor who set her arm was kind but distracted, already thinking about his next patient. A nurse gave her discharge papers and a prescription for pain medication she couldn't afford to fill. No one from the Herring family came to her room. She told herself they were with Frankie. Of course they were with Frankie. That's where they should be. She hadn't climbed that ladder for gratitude. She'd climbed it because a child was dying. But still, the silence felt like erasure. 3 days later, Miriam was released. She took a taxi back to her small apartment using money she didn't have. Her phone remained silent. No calls, no messages. The mansion was too damaged for anyone to return. The staff had been dismissed temporarily. Miriam's paycheck stopped. Weeks passed. Weeks pass, Miriam is gone. 6 weeks after the fire, Mead plantation stood transformed. The mansion had been gutted and rebuilt with surgical precision. New wiring snaked through walls that had been stripped to studs and reinforced. The narrow staircase now had modern fire-resistant materials beneath its historic facade. The nursery was reborn. Fresh paint, new furniture, windows that opened inward with emergency releases. Frankie Herring tottered through the restored halls like nothing had ever happened. His lungs had healed completely. The soot and terror were gone, replaced by a toddler's limitless energy. He laughed, he played. He showed no signs of trauma. The family had healed too, in their way. Lewis returned to his business empire. London redecorated. Thomas Keene oversaw the final construction details. Life resumed its billionaire rhythm calendars filled with meetings, galas, investment calls. But Eleanor Herring couldn't sleep. She sat in the restored parlor one evening, watching Frankie play with wooden blocks, while London scrolled through her phone. Lewis was in his study. The fire had become a story they told, a miracle, a close call, a testament to the fire department's quick response. "Who climbed that ladder?" Eleanor asked suddenly. London looked up, confused. "What?" "The day of the fire." Eleanor's voice was quiet but insistent. When Frankie was at the window. "Who climbed the ladder?" "The firefighters," London said automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, her brow furrowed. Lewis emerged from his study, drawn by his mother's tone. "What's wrong?" Eleanor stood, her posture rigid with the kind of certainty that comes from questions left too long unasked. "I want to thank them. The firefighter who saved Frankie. We never properly thanked them. Thomas Keene, who'd been reviewing blueprints at the dining table, glanced up. Good idea. I can reach out to the fire department. It took 3 days to arrange the meeting. Caleb Rowe arrived at the mansion in his dress uniform, his captain's insignia polished. He shook Lewis's hand, accepted Eleanor's embrace, listened to London's tearful gratitude with the professional grace of a man accustomed to being called a hero. But when Eleanor asked to meet the firefighter who'd made the rescue, Caleb's expression shifted. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "my team did what we could, but we never breached that structure. The floor was compromised. Protocol wouldn't allow it." The room went silent. Lewis leaned forward. "But someone got Frankie out. We saw it happen." Caleb nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Someone did." He paused, measuring his words. "She wasn't one of ours." London's face went pale. "She?" "A woman from your household staff," Caleb continued. "She took the unsecured ladder before we could stop her, climbed it without gear, pulled your son through the window. By the time she came down, we were transporting the boy. I tried to commend her, but..." He trailed off. "But what?" Lewis's voice had gone very quiet. "She was placed in a secondary ambulance. Smoke inhalation, burns, broken arm. I assumed you knew. Truth waits for readiness, not applause." Eleanor sat down slowly, her hand pressed to her chest. "What was her name?" Caleb pulled out his incident report. "Morrison. Miriam Morrison." The name landed like a stone in still water. London's phone slipped from her hand. "Miriam." Thomas Keene's face drained of color. "The maid. She..." "I dismissed the staff when the mansion closed for repairs. I never thought to..." "Where is she now?" Lewis interrupted, already on his feet. Caleb shook his head. "I don't know, sir. She left the hospital 3 days after the incident. We have no forwarding information." Lewis turned to Thomas. "Find her, now." Lewis goes looking for Miriam. It took Lewis Herring 3 months to find her. Not because Miriam Morrison was hiding, but because no one had thought to look. She wasn't on social media. Her phone number had been disconnected. The small apartment she'd rented had new tenants. It was as if she'd simply dissolved into the city's invisible population, the working poor who keep the world running and vanish the moment they stop. Lewis hired a private investigator, checked hospital records, traced her prescription for pain medication to a pharmacy in a neighborhood he'd never visited. Finally, he found her working the evening shift at a diner 40 minutes outside Nashville, her left arm still in a faded cast covered with coffee stains. He walked in alone. No cameras, no entourage, no Thomas Keene with a checkbook. Miriam was wiping down a booth when she looked up and saw him. Her hands stilled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I should have looked sooner," Lewis said quietly. Miriam set down her rag, her expression unreadable. "You were with your son. That's where you should have been. Not just that day." Lewis's voice was thick with something that sounded like shame. "After. I should have asked. Should have known your name without reading it in a fire report 3 months late." Miriam studied him, this billionaire father standing in a diner that served $3 coffee, his expensive suit completely out of place among the cracked vinyl booths and flickering fluorescent lights. "I didn't do it to be seen," she said simply. "I know." Lewis pulled out a chair, gesturing for permission. Miriam nodded, and he sat. "But you were seen. Eventually. And now, I'm here to do what I should have done that day at the hospital." He placed an envelope on the table. Inside was a check more money than Miriam had earned in 5 years. Beneath it, a letter from the best medical practice in Nashville offering to complete her treatment at no cost. And beneath that, the deed to a small house with her name on it. Miriam stared at the papers, her burned hands resting on either side of the envelope. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Lewis said firmly. "It's a debt. One I can never fully repay." He leaned forward. "Miriam, you gave my son his life. You gave my family their future, and we let you disappear into nothing. That's on me. On all of us. Miriam's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I just did what needed doing. I know, Lewis said again. And that's exactly why this matters. He stood, but before leaving, he added one more thing. My mother wants you to come to dinner. No uniform, no service, as a guest. Frankie asks about you sometimes, the woman with the soft voice who held him. He doesn't have the words yet, but he remembers. Sometimes the one who saves a life is the one the world forgets first. And sometimes, doing the impossible costs everything except your soul. 2 weeks later, Miriam stood at the front door of the restored mansion, not the service entrance, but the main door. Her arm was finally free of its cast. Her burns had faded to pale scars. She wore a simple dress Eleanor had sent, along with a note that said only, "Thank you for my grandson." London answered the door with tears already streaming. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Miriam squeezed her hand. He's okay. That's all that matters. Inside, Eleanor embraced her without words. Lewis shook her hand with a grip that conveyed everything language couldn't. Thomas Keene apologized 3 times, his contractor's confidence shattered by his own oversight. And then, from the nursery, came the sound of small footsteps. Frankie tottered into the foyer, his eyes widening with recognition that transcended memory. He didn't know her name, didn't understand what she'd done, but something in him remembered the warmth, the safety, the voice that had promised, "I've got you through smoke and fire." He reached for Miriam with both small hands. She knelt down, and Frankie walked straight into her arms. Because he remembers. Stories like this don't need applause. They need to be remembered so we notice sooner next time. The camera pulls back, not for spectacle, but for truth. A poor maid and a billionaire's son, holding on to each other in a restored mansion where the walls no longer hide fire. Where gratitude arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. Where courage, invisible for too long, was finally seen. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So, do check it out.